I get to spray the podium, so I'll let you decide which one is more entertaining. So, all right, I'm just doing it by order on my Zoom screen. Nikki Arenshorst.
Nikki Arenshorst, attending via teleconference from Holland, Michigan.
Jeff Elephant Ear Christians.
Attending, sadly, without an elephant ear via teleconference from Holland, Michigan.
Scott Corbin.
Scott Corbin attending via teleconference, Holland, Michigan.
PJ Thompson.
PJ Thompson via teleconference from Scottsdale, Arizona.
Nice.
That's too bad.
Brian.
Brian Peugeot attending via teleconference from Holland, Michigan.
And Boyd.
Boyd Feldman attending via teleconference from Holland, Michigan.
You have a quorum, Mr. Chair.
All righty. Thanks, everybody. We start with approving our meeting minutes from last time. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Thanks, Jeff. A second.
I'll second.
Thanks, Boyd. Any comments, questions, concerns from the meeting minutes last time?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
Go ahead.
My fault. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh,
Do you want me to call the roll for you? You're going to go ahead and
vote. All in favor on the meeting minutes, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. Keith, you want to call the roll?
Nope.
We've been doing this too long, Brian. Sorry. Keep going, buddy.
Good old hat here. Cool. All right. Public comment. We've got public and we've got the ability to make comments. Would anyone like to speak up on the interwebs here?
I would.
Okay, great. Oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand there.
Oh, that's okay. That's why I figured I could speak up.
That's great. Yep.
So I'll introduce myself first because I don't think a lot of you know me. I'm Mika Weiss. I live in the city of Holland, and I'm the founding board chairperson of Pedal Holland, which is an active transportation advocacy group seeking to make bicycling an easy choice for transportation and recreation in the greater Holland area. So that's kind of our tagline. We really focus on bicycling, but when we're in the room, we also do a lot of active transportation conversations generally, you know, regarding pedestrian access, a little bit of transit, things like that, just because we happen to be in the room. So that's kind of the direction that I'm coming from with my comment. And I've been doing this for about 8 years in the area. So I finally caught up on some of the old videos that I had missed originally. So I'm only about 2 months behind where you guys are right now. And there were a few things that kind of jumped out at me in your transportation conversations that I just want to talk about a little bit. I'll probably come back a couple times with comments on this, just to kind of keep thinking about it. There were a couple themes that jumped out at me when I was listening to the conversation about it. And one of the things that jumped out was the idea that there might not be a lot that we can do about this at the local level, which is kind of contrary to my experience and to the work that I've done over the last several years. You know, most of the most important work, the really foundational work, does happen at the local level. So whether you're looking at some large federal program that needs to be implemented, so, you know, there have been conversations about things like high-speed rail, or even this Grand Rapids to Holland bus line. The things that support that, those larger initiatives, happen locally. So if you think about how you're actually going to take a trip on a Grand Rapids to Holland bus, you're not starting at the bus. You've got to get from your house to the bus, and then to wherever you're going on the other side. We call that a trip chain. So you don't just have one segment in your journey, you have multiple segments in your journey. So when you break it down, when you look at it at a more granular level, the things that are making those higher level initiatives possible are the things that are happening here. So some of the most important things are things like the crosswalk right in front of your house. That's the foundation that the whole thing is laid upon. That foundational level work is required for any of those bigger things to be successful. And the same thing is true of electrification and things like that. You know, we see things like GM saying their big announcement that they're going to get out of internal combustion engines. I see that as an advocacy announcement. They're trying to get the ball rolling because they want to move in a certain direction. But all that implementation, all that has to happen on the local level. So that was the point I wanted to make today. There are a couple other things that I think are worth talking about, but that was what I had for today. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Anyone else? Make sure to turn your mute off.
I can go next if that's okay.
Sure, Jacob, go ahead.
Yeah, so hello everyone. My name is Jacob Vanderst, and I am a Hope College student living at 40 East 16th Street. And as many citizens have conveyed during public comment, environmental sustainability is really important to the residents of Holland, Michigan. That's kind of what I want to talk about today. And specifically, I want to report some encouraging news regarding green energy on the national level. So back in 2005, the US Energy Information Administration released an annual energy outlook in which they made projections regarding the estimated carbon dioxide emissions, electricity generation, and employment in green energy within the United States. So these projections were made back in 2005. And I'm happy to report that our current situation here in 2021 is much more sustainable than what these projections had estimated back in 2005. And I will now explain a few examples of this based on data collected by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in Berkeley, California. So our current electricity-related carbon dioxide emission rates are 52% lower than what was estimated in the 2005 projection. And over the past 15 years, the United States has decreased their electricity-related carbon dioxide emissions by 40%. Therefore, we have been able to significantly decarbonize the electricity grid within the United States. And this is primarily due to where we are getting our electricity from. When comparing 2005 to 2020, we have seen a 133% increase in the use of renewable energy and a 112% increase in natural gas usage. Simultaneously, our dependence upon coal has notably decreased by 62%, and that's over the course of only 15 years. Therefore, the US has been experiencing a transition to cleaner forms of electricity generation. And despite our population growth, we have been able to use our electricity efficiently. The total electricity sales of 2020 were only 0.14% greater than that of 2005, just an increase of only 0.14%. So over the course of about 15 years, the United States electricity demand has essentially remained constant because we're using it a lot more efficiently. And lastly, we have been able to divert more jobs towards cleaner electricity generation than what was projected in 2005. The number of jobs in renewables and natural gas were greater in 2019 than what was projected in 2005. And the number of jobs in coal was less in 2019 than in the 2005 projection. Thus, we are effectively shifting the job market towards more sustainably and environmentally safe options. And so these are the major take-home messages from all these data that was released by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. We can decarbonize how we generate electricity, we can do it effectively, and the movement towards green energy is prevalent. Therefore, the goal of reducing Holland's emissions by 50% by 2030, it is an ambitious goal, but these released data demonstrate that ambitious goals can be accomplished and exceeded. Keeping all of this in mind, the Holland Community Energy Plan needs to incorporate the goal of decreasing our emissions by 50% every 10 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. Anyone else care to share? Okay. Is that it? Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Checking out the online comments. We do need a vote to acknowledge that they should be put into the public record. There were just a couple, if I recall accurately. How do we do this? Do we want to vote or a motion to include these in the public record? Anyone?
I'll make the motion.
Thanks, Boyd. A second.
I'll second.
Thanks, Jeff. Does anyone have any comments on the comments, or we're not really doing that, or you can if you want to?
No, I'm just, again, I'm glad that the comments that are sent to city council are sent here, and the ones that are sent to us are, that they're combined. I think that's important.
Great. Good. Well, all in favor of including them in the public record, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. They're in for real.
All right.
Cool. So we have two big topics today. We are going to spend time talking about the last lever, the non-residential built environment lever. We do have Mary Ellen from Steelcase, it looks like, on the call for Q&A potentially. So we've got her here, which is, well, or at least it looks like it. So that's super nice of her to join and be a resource for us. And then the other big chunky thing we have is Joe Sikma from the ODC has got his, a lot of his research. I don't know if it's quite done, but it's very close. And he's got, more than 30 seconds to give us today. And we're going to give him more than that today. So those are our two big topics for the day. So let's start with the first, which is revisiting the commercial, institutional, industrial lever.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to, I know you already recognize Mary Ellen. I too want to thank her for coming back and making the presentation she did 2 meetings ago. She was the one to sort of kick off the topic and introduce some of the activities going on with Steelcase, and also just introducing how primary manufacturers are thinking about these issues. And so we really appreciate that. And then if you recall at the last meeting that we had, Ann Salyers made a presentation on some of our different programs that we've worked on for our business sector over the past years, and including the revamping of our energy waste reduction program with increased funding and targets. And Ann is also with us this afternoon. And then the last topic, although they are not present today, I'm sure we can help answer some questions or have dialogue on PACE financing, which was a presentation that this group heard, which is the property assessed clean energy financing for businesses. And there's some dialogue going on at both, well, primarily at Ottawa County, but I think Allegan County remains interested as well, about creating districts here that would allow for PACE financing to take hold there. So those are really kind of the 3 main topics over a 2-session period of time. This was the lever that was really deserving of multiple meetings because of the amount of meat on it. And so just really appreciate Ann and Mary Ellen being available to this group as well. So, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing them.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, Ann, did you have a comment?
Well, I do. I'd like to give a shout out to Mary Ellen. First, thank you for joining us again today. And I was reading the Western Michigan University magazine this weekend and spotted that Mary Ellen's been appointed to the Michigan Environmental Rules Review Committee by Governor Gretchen Whitmer with the advice and consent of the Michigan Senate. So congratulations. That'll be a good spot for them to have your expertise.
Thanks, Ann. happy to serve. Yeah, and I'm happy to be here to answer any questions too. So I'll just stay on.
That's great. So as many of you know, of our remaining, carbon footprint in town, we sort of have an outsized percentage or emphasis on the commercial industrial built environment relative to our town size. We have quite a bit of industry, and the latest calculations had the buildings in that category representing 71% of our carbon footprint. So it's, the biggest opportunity for us. And we heard a lot about where business is headed from Mary Ellen, and a lot about what is already in motion with Anne, and learned a little bit about a way to finance some of these projects. I'm interested in seeing who's on the phone, and I'm interested in hearing from all of you on what questions or comments you have around the levers, or excuse me, around the ideas in that lever in the opportunity matrix. So feel free to jump in.
So I guess as I'm looking at the opportunity matrix and some of the stats for the city, a couple things jump out. One, I think like creating a PACE district, to my mind, like is kind of a no-brainer as a tool for Holland to have in the toolbox to support industry. I think one of the things, I'm just looking at some of the pie charts that we have for the carbon per capita. 47% of so you said 71% of the total carbon footprint is industry. Is that right? 81%.
I believe it's 71 if I'm not mistaken.
71, 43 plus 28, 71. So 47% is commercial and industrial electricity. So, right, the majority of that 70% is electricity usage.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we kind of can't have a conversation about industrial usage without having a conversation about the electricity portfolio of the city, right? You cut the greenhouse gas emissions in industry by more than two-thirds, just with electricity. And then I guess the other comment on that, I feel like, and I don't have a good feel for what the best way to do this is, but we have, right, electricity being generated locally. Then you have local businesses going out and buying renewable energy credits and supporting like renewable energy projects around the country. I feel like we need ways to start to marry these goals, right? So if local industry has goals, renewable targets and carbon neutrality targets and things, like how do we fit those together kind of tighter into what the city is trying to do, and have, local companies' ambitions mesh better with the city's ambitions, so that some of the investment like actually is supporting the transition for the BPW, and kind of, I don't know, I guess that maybe Mary Ellen, you have maybe some insight in how Holland can do that better. But that's, I guess, looking at the opportunity matrix, there's not really a piece that tries to fit industry's goals closely with the city's goals.
And Dave, could you remind us, how would it work relative to the RPS and the voluntary renewable energy purchasing through Holland BPW? How does that work? Like if a big business wants to buy RECs, they want to buy renewable energy, and they wanted to buy it through the BPW, would that then increase? Would that just add on to the 15% of the RPS? And now we're at like 18% or 20%? Or
Correct.
is that how that works? Help us.
Correct. Everybody is assumed to have 15% in their portfolio today. That's why if you elect the renewable energy rider, you're able to secure an additional 85% to get up to 100%. So, as companies or individuals would elect that, it's going to continue to shift the BPW's total portfolio. If you're buying it through the BPW, then it's going to shift the BPW's portfolio, and we're going to commit to retiring those certificates on behalf of the customers that elect that renewable energy.
So I'm just making this up. I'm LG Chem, or I'm a business in town, and I'm 5% of the overall BPW load. And I decide we're going to buy renewable energy through the Holland BPW program. The utility now has moved from 15 to 20%.
Yes.
Okay. And if I'm a business and I don't like that price and I decide I want to buy the REC somewhere else, to Jeff's point, it's just out on the market because it's just more cost effective, for whatever reason. Right now, the current status is that may or may not be happening, but we don't have a mechanism to like even capture whether we know or not if it is.
Right. I think that's something that we're identifying here. And I don't know if we've captured it completely in the opportunity matrix at this time, but I think one of the strategies would be to build data flow and awareness, understanding what the business's goals and objectives are, but then also what programs they have underway so that there can be an accurate accounting from a community perspective on what's actually happening. So, and that does not completely exist at this time. We started that road with our last customer satisfaction survey, where we asked our business customers whether they're actively doing any of that right now. And we actually saw some response, like there was some activity going on. And so that means that we're a little bit unaware of that. And so there may be some need for tying those things together and creating that accounting and understanding how they look at that too. As you mentioned, Brian, early on when we had the presentation on offsets and credits, there's also this additionality versus, what's out there on the market today. And so people have different preferences, in terms of location and type and whether it's additional or not. So just kind of understanding the totality of that among our customer base is probably something that we need to work on.
Yeah, and I'll add just a real life example, Dave, from what we just went through a few weeks ago. So on the commercial front for my little shop downtown, Peachway Frozen Yogurt, I got curious to put myself through the process of how could that store become carbon neutral from all the things we've learned on these calls, and what would a small business owner, how would they navigate it? And how could the BPW play a role? So I went down a path to understand, how I could purchase through the BPW, but just on an independent search through a National Geographic article I had read, another company called cooleffect.org was offering also the ability for either individuals to do a lot of travel, for example, a lot of jet flying and things like that, or small businesses to purchase their own certificate for offsets, for carbon offsets. So when I priced that out, it was a simple tool online that gave me a price. I could use my BPW bills, and it gave me a price about how many metric tons I was emitting from the store we were emitting. And so to buy about 46 metric tons was a few clicks of the button, credit card after some diligence on this company. And there was a price difference between the BPW and this company. And there were some merits to doing one-stop shop through the BPW's program. And then there's some merits for simplicity of a click of a few buttons. You get issued a certificate. It's an annual offset. You could keep renewing. The price was a little bit more efficient. So I did go that other route, that third-party route, out of curiosity. Part of me wanted to just support BPW, but the other part of me, as a role in this group, was let me explore. What's it look like and feel like to get a certificate through a third-party organization when you're just a small business? Very straightforward, very simple. And Dave supported that behind the scenes as I was thinking through it and costing it and understanding what the shop consumed. And the shop consumes a lot. Without the renewable energy the BPW provides, I would be emitting somewhere around 55 metric tons a year from that little store. And I purchased 46 to offset. And now that incentivized me to go do some other things at that store to reduce its energy consumption, little, timers, photo cells. It did motivate me and my store team to go take some other actions, because now I felt motivated next year when I renew. Not only would I like to see the BPW have a higher renewable percentage, so I have to purchase less, but I also wanted to reduce our consumption, in shop. So now I've got a financial incentive. The store is carbon neutral, but now the BPW doesn't know how to track me, because I did go. And I think over time, it's here now already. It's going to be very simple. There's going to be a lot of competition out there from different organizations offering these simplistic tools to work outside of, maybe your municipal system. So it's interesting from a strategy standpoint. How can the BPW still lead the way, or how in city government lead the way to get our arms wrapped around it, regardless of who you purchase from? But can it be a leadership position so you can accumulate the information? Because there's suggested vendors, perhaps BPW is one of them. I just thought I'd share that anecdote and that experience where this is a real thing, and it's really coming fast,
We started almost down that road in April, and I think, Keith, you were away, and we discussed the survey at the end, and there was the survey from the Frost Center, and then Jim was talking about a survey with businesses, because this is exactly what they were thinking, is businesses are in that position. They want to be a part of this carbon reduction. How do they do it? Is the city, or city BPW being team members, going to be part of this? What are they going to do? Are they leading it? Is the business leading it? And we ended it because we needed all of staff there, and then that's where we are. But I think that's exactly right. We need to be leaders.
Back then, those conversations, my mind was around the big companies.
Mm-hmm.
And the personal enlightenment for me is how easy it is for the accumulation of the little guys to get carbon neutral really fast for the very small investment. The investment was about $400 for the year to buy 46.
And refrigeration is a lot of energy, isn't it?
Yeah. And I do, Dave, it caught his eye on how much energy I was consuming at the shop. Very different than a Kill Ones, very different than a Captain Sunday. We are magnitudes higher because we've got the equivalent of about 22 fridges and freezers, the way that business works going on, let alone AC, LED signage that they would have too. So if you even just started out with a hit list of your larger consumer, commercial folks and stuff, and work, it was very simple, very fast to get it done, to go carbon neutral at a very low cost, but it's tracking. I don't think, I would imagine the BPW is fairly agnostic to who it's purchased from.
So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. And I think the other piece of it is the BPW can give you RECs right now, but you got the whole offset. You got your thermal use taken care of. You got your electric use taken care of. And that's what a carbon offset can do, different from a REC. A REC can deal with the electricity carbon related, impacts. A carbon offset directly can take care of any carbon impacts, whether it's electric or thermally driven.
You can even, as an employer, click a button to estimate your employees' carbon emissions from to and fro work. They're even offsetting on the transportation side. And that's an option. You can click in or click out of that. So depending on if you're a big commuter, company, then you can check that button as well. So you can take it a step upstream even more. So yeah, thanks, Dave.
So Boyd, I want to be crystal clear. You did not buy the renewable energy from the BPW and then buy carbon offsets for your gas, for your heating, consumption. You just bought you bought everything through the carbon offset because it was simpler, just basically customer service, ease of use, basically.
Yeah. Self-serve, online, you can research. The biggest thing that worried me, where I could picture needing a local leadership role, was that organization trustworthy? We're kind of new in the process. And so who was I giving my money to? And that was why I reached out to Dave to just say, there's a lot of due diligence you can do in their website. What do you think? And of course he couldn't officially endorse, but he goes, look, it looks good. The projects seem legit. They have a bit of a track record, but to answer your question, it was a one-stop shop where they are packing in a lot of assumptions for typical businesses. You are still using your utility bill to estimate consumption on the electrical front, but yes, then they wrap it with more assumptions around packaging, even, the energy that's going into your pack. So you select what type of business you are. And since I'm a restaurant, there's a little different set of assumptions applied to a restaurant than maybe some other office building, for example, or office environment.
Yeah.
Had Boyd looked a little further, he would have found out that it was a wholly owned subsidiary of Dave Coster Enterprises. But I mean, no,
so
seriously, not.
You're the agnostic right out the door, Dave.
Exactly. Right. No, not at all.
But there's tools, and I just think and that's for the little guy, and that could be for the individual citizen. And I loved how they position, if you happen to be a big business traveler, for example, and maybe your company isn't doing offsets, you as an individual could still purchase offsets for the amount of commuting or jet flying. You just pump in some assumptions, and then you're buying those offsets. And I found the holistic view of purchasing offsets, and now marketing is being made as we speak for my shop, that it is a carbon neutral shop with some graphics that show how we've done it. I'm holding the certificate, that shows how much I purchased. Dave and VPW shares how much of my energy is coming from renewable already. So it's a little education on some simple math, where to go, and then providing options, a menu of options for people. And I think from a strategic point of view, the aha for me was, there are really good, simple, low-cost options to make a ton of progress now, and it's only going to get better.
Hey, Boyd.
Yeah, Michigan Save, does a lot of work in checking out the contractors associated with our home energy retrofit program, right, and vetting them that way. One of the strategies that we've talked about has been, creating a community carbon offset purchasing collaborative, and that's the kind of thing where maybe there is that ability to provide a clearinghouse of potential third parties, that are vetted, somehow as being, and then a much easier way for people to understand what it is that you're buying if you're buying through one of these vetted, trusted third-party entities, and so that's maybe a possibility that could be pursued. And I know ultimately the question was asked of Mary Ellen too, in terms of kind of, Jeff asked, what could Holland be doing? So I want to make sure that she's had a chance to answer Jeff's question on that.
Yeah, no problem. So one thing that we've done at Steelcase to help with our suppliers, some of whom are small, some are huge, but some are very small, was to offer them the same pricing that we get for our renewable energy certificates. And that was quite a number of years ago when we first committed to 100% renewable energy. We have not yet done the same from an offset perspective, but I think we could. We buy in quantity, both for sure. So I think the only challenge might be kind of the logistics of accounting for things and then getting the timing aligned. But you could certainly do some sort of a co-op or group purchase. I've even talked with folks at WEMIAC about this kind of idea before, because, Steelcase, for instance, wouldn't necessarily want to limit it to just Steelcase suppliers. I mean, if we're able to get pricing that's a lot better than what a typical small company might be able to get, and if our broker is open to the idea, we'd be happy to welcome more and more people in to that. And in terms of the qualifications of the RECs and offsets, so our offsets, or excuse me, our RECs have to be Green E certified. And then we typically go with National Wind RECs. And then our offsets, I was just looking up what some of the certifications are, and I don't know what all these acronyms stand for, but they're CCB or VCW or ACR. But there are apparently quite a few different categories for offsets, and we, felt the same way. It sounds like, Boyd, you were doing a fair amount of homework on that. We were concerned about, not getting involved with projects that we didn't feel that comfortable with. For instance, we made sure that we were focusing on reforestation and afforestation projects, not landfill gas projects, for instance. But those could be, the criteria that a group might select.
Yeah. So yeah, Dave, I would love to see that, make the opportunity matrix in a draft form, and next time we could review it, but with your expertise of how might that strategy be worded, right? I think that could be huge.
I think offsets, that was one of the reasons why we had the offsets and rec conversation early, is I think there's a strong intention on having something intentional around in the report on an offset and rec program.
Yeah.
Somehow, some way. Keith, before, I just got a tiny question for Boyd, and then you can jump in there, Keith. Boyd, on the purchase, the $400, did you get a chance to sort of like pick what what was the experience like on what you decided to fund? Or did you get a chance to decide to fund something, or was it just what they decided?
It's more like a mutual fund, I would say, and so while they disclose what projects are active, they also disclose what projects are now completed, that they've done in the past. You don't get to select the projects. It's a smorgasbord that is global. Just so you can see yourself, it's cooleffect.org. Cooleffect.org. And it'll break my heart if it turns out to be not as legitimate as I was.
No, I think it's probably a blended situation. I'm on their site right now, and there are projects that you can procure individually as well, but there's probably a
threshold,
kind of a conglomerate of projects that go into that blended rate. For what Boyd did there, but there's a number of different projects around the world, frankly, that you could look at on cooleffect.org if you just click on their projects section.
That would be into being a small business. You'll see how you can put in your basic assumptions, and then it spits out a price, and then you pay on credit card, and then you're issued a certificate.
That would be an interesting thing to explore, is if there could be, it would be more expensive per metric ton to offset, but to actually have like local projects that people could choose to fund, right? And then you could get all of the, stuff going on around the globe, and it's a lot cheaper. But if I'm a resident and I care a ton about this, wouldn't it be cool to plant a tree?
That was one of Dave's, as we were evaluating it, that was one of Dave's, real strong points is, the BPWs might be a little more expensive. They are going through though a lot of certification. They're Michigan projects, so some of theirs were points. Like I said, I was really tempted to do the one-stop shop, fund local, but I said, let me try this third-party way. I just wanted that experience of outside the bubble, and I wanted to highlight how would that even get measured then. Whose dashboard does that hit?
Yeah. Well, that's the exercise for sure, right? Like there's already a market for this stuff, and how do we lead and lift it up and help tell the story, and then capture, and catalog it, right? Is I think it, whether we have our own programming specifically or not, like minimally marketing it and cataloging it are opportunities. You think, Keith, you're gonna ask a question?
Yeah, real simple. I was just going to highlight, and Boyd did a great job where, for this group, and just a reminder of kind of how the system, has worked up until now, is Boyd said, for the 8 of you, you figure out how would you word the strategy that you recommend to council, because you'd stay at the strategy level, and then that would ultimately have council give an assignment to staff to figure out how to tackle that to the ground and do all the details, right, with the steering committee work. So it's like, and oversimplifying, the strategy would be come up with, maybe one program to investigate. How would you have a local program where you could buy? And then another strategy could be, how do you make sure that you get, the reporting for those companies like Boyd, that we're recording the credits that he's buying, in the private market. I love Boyd too. I can't say it. You said to and fro. Only a person of a frozen yogurt place talks about to and fro. I love that.
To and fro, yo.
My gosh, that's good. No, that's all good. I have a question for Mary Ellen, unless someone else wants to jump in with another comment or question around this, any of the stuff that we've been talking about in this lever. Okay, I'm sure you all just are being patient and will go after me. So Mary Ellen, so I happen to know that a lot of businesses, the internal people working on energy efficiency and energy reduction and energy projects oftentimes find themselves in a tough spot at larger organizations because they're battling for financial resources or capital with, I'll oversimplify and call them like top line sort of projects, right? So how have you at Steelcase, or how are you guys wrestling with sort of unpacking the old way of financially looking at these projects such that you can do more energy efficiency and do more on-site renewables, and you can do more stuff? Because I know that there's lots of good people that want to do lots of things and have projects and have business cases, but they sort of lose internally to a new piece of equipment that makes a part a little bit faster, or a new sales initiative. How do you think about that, and how do you imagine other businesses are thinking about that as it relates to, these big goals and having to really invest in energy efficiency moving forward?
Yeah, so what we're doing at Steelcase is, since we've committed to these 50% absolute reductions in emissions by 2030, and we've already started the process of having the engineering audits at our different manufacturing facilities. And even though we're coming up with lots of projects, like you said, these projects are not cheap, and they're not as cost effective on the surface as a lot of other, capital equipment projects for different purposes. So we had to make an argument to our CEO and our CFO and others that they needed to change the bar for projects that are energy efficiency projects associated with our carbon strategy. And the two ways that we really changed the bar is in the payback timeframe, and also by, and this is something we haven't implemented yet, we're in the process of trying to figure out how best to implement it, by trying to put what we're calling a shadow price on carbon in our system that is it's called our management authorization request system. And that's basically any large purchase has to go through this MAR process. But if that purchase first of all, it has to be a Michigan project. There's a reason that it's specific to Michigan for this price on carbon. But then secondly, it would have to have, energy type of impacts. But then people will see what the total cost would have been or would be in a future where we do have a carbon tax. So that's the one that we're still figuring out. But we did right off the bat get a different payback timeframe that's more reasonable. So that's helping us out.
Are you allowed to say what the new ROI threshold is? versus
You
the other?
know, they didn't, I would say it's a little bit, I don't think they gave it absolute hard and fast, but I would say we might be able to get away with like a 4-year payback.
Versus a 18-month or 2 or
Yeah, usually it would be pretty tight. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
I was on a call with a bunch of GM people the other day, and Al Hedrith, who's like the head of energy for GM, and on the facility side, said that they use a $25 shadow price for carbon.
Yeah.
So that's a data point for you if you.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, we're planning on even higher than that, but yep, makes sense. And it makes a difference. The reason we're applying that to just Michigan is because of the Michigan energy market, and we happen to be a choice customer.
Right.
So, you know, great that we pay less on a day-to-day basis for our electricity, but not great when you're trying to price out, you know, a solar project on your Michigan property.
Yeah, hurts your ROI, the cheaper the
Yeah.
unit price. Yeah. So 4 years that's hot. That's awesome. That's really awesome from a standpoint of getting more projects done. That is, yeah, that a lot more, I'm imagining a lot more projects are going to become possible now because of that.
Yeah, that's what we hope.
Did you guys, I've seen some articles, I think Anheuser-Busch and maybe Apple and a couple other big companies have recently come out with green bonds, effectively like raising a separate source of capital to specifically allocate towards all of their carbon goals. Was that ever on the table with Steelcase? Have you heard, or, you know, creating like a whole nother, you know, pot of money?
So we talked about that. We had hoped, in fact, probably about 1.5 years ago, we had hoped to pursue what we were calling a green revolving fund. But no, that didn't make it. So we end up still having to kind of play that challenging game of figuring out exactly which budget or cost center the money is going to come from.
Right.
We don't have money coming in to a particular cost center to help with it. So, but I think those are really great ideas. So that's something that we wish we could do, and maybe we can, you know, bring it up again.
Yeah, down the road. Would you,
Yeah.
and I'm putting you on the spot here, but I think it's helpful for everybody and you don't have to answer this. Could you expound on why the Green Revolving Fund didn't go anywhere?
I don't know that I know all the reasons. There were a couple of people on my team who were really in the details on it, but I think we're very, I don't know.
Cool. It's okay.
I don't know all the reasons. No,
Yeah.
so I shouldn't even speculate because what
no,
I recall is not necessarily that accurate, but they weren't ready maybe for something that novel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Sounds good. Dave.
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of building off from that, I know that's been a conversation that's been kicked around a little bit here as we've been talking about PACE financing, for example, and just as a strategy, you know, easing the capital financing burden for businesses really is a strategy, you know, kind of an objective to work on. And what's interesting, and again, not an area where, you know, we directly here might be able to do something, you know, in terms of a funding situation, but just recognizing, I talked to Brian and Travis a little bit about what's interesting at the state level, that the state has created revolving loan funds for municipal sewer and water projects. And we actually, our digester is being financed with about $30 million of what they call clean water state revolving fund dollars. And, you know, it would be interesting with this being an emphasis at the state level too, and also at the federal level, would be, you know, whether or not the state would have any ability. Number one, maybe there might need to be some statutory authority given, but they have a framework in place. It'd be interesting to see, whether or not the state could create some kind of program for businesses, that is already in place for municipalities in terms of accessing it for infrastructure projects, provided there was some kind of scoring system or, something along those lines that would help sort of prioritize and award that. Is something that we've kind of been talking about a little bit, and maybe there's an opportunity to sort of encourage the state to consider that through their climate solutions group that's currently meeting as they're wrestling with, trying to look at strategies at a state level on how to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. So
I did make a little call on that, Dave, and I'm playing a little phone tag, but through some of the homework I've done, I did learn that there is a group around easy for me to say, around mobility and EV charging, trying to get like a revolving fund around that in particular. That is not a that's, I think, some version of an active group. So I don't know what that means, but I do know that something there exists on some level. And like I said, I am playing phone tag with some people and on the revolving loan fund idea at the state level. It's super interesting. So maybe the EV charging could be something we can also participate in.
Yeah, and I'll just add two things there, Brian. One, on the EV charging, I know that I've already slowly planting the seed, because the smart zone is not, I don't have a vote on it, and it's not me, it's not the city, right? But we're kind of hopeful that that would be an investment the smart zone could make as they're doing tax captures in our downtown district, of maybe investing in some more charging infrastructure, which would make sense. So, but Dave, just for an idea, because we talked about that revolving loan fund at the state too, because I think it's helpful. Give kind of a size and scope of what that means for our anaerobic digester project that you guys are taking the lead on.
Yeah, I mean, we're financing about 95% of the cost of the project through that. And there's many other municipalities that are also, doing their own projects of various kinds. And the state usually will prioritize those projects based upon a number of different factors, whether it's helping to offset a chronic compliance issue in a community, or whether there's a disadvantaged community, or whether the project has significant green attributes, to help prioritize it. And so there's a scoring system to that, but it's a low interest. For us, it's a 20+ year bond, that is a 2% or less, depending upon the year. And then with our project, there was also some principal forgiveness that came in because of the green project nature of it. So we actually got 20% principal forgiveness on it too. Again, that's all based upon a construct where the federal government is supplementing money into the state for these infrastructure projects. So you'd have to have this relationship, I think, first the state to create the project, and then the federal government relationship with the states to actually seed money in, as well as maybe supplement projects that have a various value to them, from meeting the overall targets on a federal level. That's the concept that I think could be put forward here, whether or not it would have legs, and actually earn some sort of legislative support to be able to give the administrative group to ability to actually implement it. That's a big question, I think. But if the state is looking at this, if there's big federal goals, there is a model out there for revolving loan funds. It's just been operated with infrastructure on water and sewer as opposed to green projects, but doesn't mean that model couldn't be extrapolated into that area.
Yeah. Good. Other questions or comments around Ann's presentation, all the energy waste reduction efforts historically moving forward? PJ.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I guess when you look at the businesses around the Holland area within, our city, many of them are medium-sized privately owned companies that do consume substantial amounts of electricity. I think just the concept of the community carbon offset collaborative would be highly attractive to most of the business owners that I interact with in that group. I think that some of the other ideas from the opportunity matrix and other ones that we could add if we examined the community energy plans of some other communities that have a large industrial base would also be attractive to these privately owned businesses. If we could put them together in such a way that those businesses themselves are given the opportunity to publicly sign up and align themselves. And perhaps too, some of the reduction objectives that we would want to propose would be more acceptable if our businesses knew, hey, the city is providing a way that we can get together as a group. They will make it easy for each of us individual owners to feel like we're doing something with our other fellow manufacturers. I think that would be really good. I thought, Mary Ellen, I just enjoy hearing the, Steelcase. I know several people who work there, fantastic, ideas. I have to candidly say, as for most private business owners, we have our own investment criteria, whether it be, return on investment or years out when we're making decisions. It's very difficult for private business owners, I feel, to accept, I don't want to, this is not a nice word, but the contrived ways of looking at return on equity that puts in something, or return on investment that puts in something, they just don't have the patience for it. But yet at the same time, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't find investments somewhat like what Boyd described as being very attractive if it were presented in such a way that the businesses would be doing it collectively as a group in making individual contributions to an overall objective that we set.
Yeah, I think that sort of gets to a little bit of maybe, PJ, if there was whether an individual company created a shadow price for carbon, set that aside, if the community had a shadow price for carbon, and then there was a community buy that you could participate in and like offset your contribution sort of thing, it'd be a little bit of it'd be a different way to message sort of the same thing. So that at least what you just said there made me think of that.
I think you're right, Brian. I think, again, as a private business owner, if you tell me or us to do something that we feel is somewhat contrived, we're going to say no. Ultimately, the economics at its lowest term wins. But at the same time, most of us control the investments of our company. If we know it is part of a meaningful reduction program that's going to serve the greater good of the community, I think you're going to find a lot of the Holland businesses are going to really want to step up.
And that would really lend itself to having some local projects to fund.
True. And I thought that's a fascinating idea. I mean, I think Boyd or somebody mentioned that it might make it a little more expensive or a little, but it sure is a great idea. The more meaningful, knowing where those proceeds are going, the more we can identify with it, well, of course, we'll be more motivated. But I still think there's a lot of mileage for us to propose as a city a way for great of privately owned manufacturers who do consume substantial amounts of electricity, the opportunity to get together as a group, maybe officially and publicly make a commitment and be part of these reduction goals that are going to happen.
So our strategies will be, some big ones from BPW, engineering, top-down kinds of things, and then the opportunity for this citywide, business, community-wide collaboration work, and then both groups working together. I mean, it has to be, going forward, everyone has to contribute somehow. either BPW has a plan, city has a plan, and then the business community has to buy in on their own level. If that's
Yeah.
our strategy to reduce carbon.
Yeah, Nikki, 100%. I mean, frankly, like nobody's getting to any kind of meaningful, aggressive goal without the residents and businesses
Correct.
doing, most of the work. I think this term on-ramps, I've heard like 10 times in the last 2 weeks of my life, but this is like really what we're doing here, right? Is like creating on-ramps and programs that are well known. So Mary Ellen mentioned the first thing they're doing is they're doing energy audits of their facilities. That's an education exercise, right? Like what's here, what's possible. So these programs have to be well known, and then they have to be attractive business cases, which is the other thing that we're talking about. And we talked about, Mary Ellen mentioned it as well, like the ROI threshold going from 2 to 4 a year includes, that many more projects, and how we internalize the price of carbon, either individually or collaboratively, all go into that business case. And then that third piece in businesses is, okay, we know what it is. We like the business case. Now, how do we pay for it? And that's PACE. That's a green revolving fund. That's 2% of, or that's the doubling of the rebates that we already know is in motion, or maybe not doubling is the wrong way to put that. Doubling of the goal, not necessarily doubling of each incentive. But yeah, this happens to be my world, but these like knowledge, business case, and capital to pay, these are the 3 hurdles with most companies that you have to overcome. And I think maybe a 4th one is time, is this idea of like, it's not core business, right? Like PJ's business is not to reduce energy. It's to like make quality parts for his customers, right? And Mary Ellen's business is, Steelcase is making furniture, right? Like that's core. And so time is the other thing I think that is maybe that 4th hurdle. And I wanted to actually ask Anne, could you talk a little bit more, and I'm putting you on the spot here, but I know you guys did a pilot with the Strategic Energy Management program, SEM, I think it's referred to. Could you just talk to the group a little bit about what that was, and just like what you liked and didn't like, and if that's moving forward on any level? Because I think that program is really comprehensive, and it gets at this time construct a little bit as well.
Sure. It's a year-long cohort group. Our first group had, I think, about 8 different companies involved. Transmatic was one of them, and as participants, and it's educational. It uses the same total quality management practices to identify and find energy cost savings. So getting a team of people together to brainstorm ideas and identify process changes that they could do that would help save money. And as part of the process, an energy model is built for the company. So, they can see the consumption per widget of their production, and track their energy usage better. And if they make small changes, like their shutdown procedures on a weekend, the impact of that. So it's very educational. The energy model gives a good tool for the people who are working day to day to try to manage energy for the company, or do the preventative maintenance, that sort of thing, to make the business case, then to their CFO, CEO, COO. And so it's a really terrific program. And so we started a second group last fall of companies, and they're not all manufacturers, like Hope College went through it. The Aquatic Center is in this group, and the city's in this group. And so it's, I think, something that we'll continue to offer. And, but they have to make a little bit of time to participate. But it's great hand-holding support for the companies. And on average, in the first group, they had energy savings of 3.5% for the year, which is really pretty good when it's all no and low cost things that they did to find those energy savings.
Yeah, and I think, it was time for them to invest, but I would argue if they were trying to do energy management excellently on their own accord without a program like that, they would have all had to spend way more time trying to figure out stuff from the ground up. And so it was an adder, but actually, I think it actually helped them probably save a ton of time in the effort to save those dollars and kilowatt hours. PJ.
Yeah, Brian, I would totally agree. And Transmatic participated in 2019. We thought this was fantastic. We still have the 12-page report that was provided to us. And apart from just the company itself benefiting, if we were to take the reports of all the participants, we would likely be able to find some specific things that are common in these reports that we could aggregate and challenge all local businesses to try to focus on. And, to me, that too is something that if we take a peek at some of the community energy plans of other cities, that's what they're doing. And they're finding, whether it be I think I mentioned before, motor processing or compressed air usage, or pick your specific thing that many manufacturers have in common that they have to do. Well, setting up best practices and maybe some challenges for the companies in the aggregate could be really a meaningful way for these companies to just further identify with what we're trying to do.
Yeah. One other thought I had was just, I think we talked about a few weeks ago with Frost Center too, is, segmentation of different types of, manufacturers, commercial entities. And I'm bringing this up because I think testimonials are so powerful, in business decision-making. One of the first things you do typically is you say, well, is that testimonial anything like me? Anything I can relate to? And so I think the strategy we're talking about here, even to gain buy-in, and you think through different phases, Dave, as you're writing it up, it's so important to start out with a first phase that doesn't, I think, resist the urge to just go after the big fish initially. I think cross-sectional representation, big and small, manufacturers, commercial, retail, restaurant, trying to have and build early on some testimonials on whatever the program is, right? That there can be wide involvement and that you can relate, owners can relate to a good cross section of, well, that's a good testimonial for me. Wow, if they're doing, okay, you got my attention. And like I said, I think weeks ago when we first started talking about offsets as a topic, my mind went to, this is for the big boys. This isn't for me. How wrong was that? It was so wrong, and it was self-taught that was wrong. So I think the strategy has to be so purposeful on how to approach that phase one testimonial building so that there is a wide, buy-in, equitable buy-in across the community.
I think you're getting at some of the things that are called out in the education plan too. When you look at building these trusted partnerships, building building the relationship with entities that can carry a story forward because like you said, it's relatable. I think is a key part of that. Clarifying what's in it for the business, if that's involved, that there's some real solid opportunities there, and showing the success stories that have happened, like you said, across the different segments of the customer base, of the business type in the community. And I think that's part of the emphasis of like the education plan really, is to build upon some of those things.
And Boyd, I think you nailed it too, right? Like it's education, it's marketing, it's program, right? But ultimately, like you put that together, PJ Thompson from Transmatic has a testimonial that's matched with a targeted program that speaks to other like-minded industries in Holland, right? Has the potential to really move the needle.
Yeah.
But
he wouldn't move it for me necessarily. No,
and then
not a
Boyd,
guy.
and then you do the same thing, right, in a different segment.
Yeah.
And we put a collection of those together that's part education, part program, part challenge,
pilot,
a lot of trusted partners, right? And now you've got something that really comes together. So I love the discussion. I think it's really good stuff.
Yeah, and I know that part of the community feedback, Jim Stelter, is we're going to do a listening tour, and we've touched on this a few times throughout our entire months of working and talking. But I think part of our report really needs to emphasize the ongoing nature of the tracking of what's happening in town, whatever that looks like. Like we've got to, whether we're asking people about if they offset carbon or not, or if they participated in RECs, like it doesn't, whatever we're asking, we just got to build the machinery to ask those questions, get those answers, and then publicly report them in an ongoing way versus, every 3 to however many years. So, and that'll build momentum on its own, right? Just like every year, here's where we're at. Like that in and of itself will build momentum. So, just to, I can round out this part, unless anyone else has a big comment, I think it's so important and it's not lost on us. Mary Ellen, what Steelcase is doing, and companies like Steelcase, like a GM, or, consumer facing brands that have big supply chains, your leadership in all of this stuff is a massive tailwind for everybody else. When a supplier of a Steelcase or a GM sees their client having these goals and naming these values, they have to pay attention if they want to stay in your good graces and keep doing business with you. And I just think it's so important. And so thanks so much for your leadership, in particular in the business sector here, because it's a huge piece of our pie, and you guys stepping up really makes all of our programs that much more meaningful and adoptable, I would say.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, we're excited that it does have a much broader effect than just our own four walls. Yeah, it's a cool thing. It's cool to see a lot of our customers are now insisting upon, big carbon strategies like ours too. So
yeah,
definitely is kind of spreading like wildfire.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah.
Are there any final comments or questions on the commercial, institutional, industrial building lever? Otherwise, we will put a pin in it like we have for our other levers and move forward. And then when we write the report, we'll be circling back on all this stuff.
Just one comment on what you said previously is, as we keep building on this, and instead of having a 3 or 5 year report just to keep an ongoing kind of monitoring, we may at one point want to consider having a person designated for that. I mean, a paid position. How do you do this? A volunteer to keep doing this. A true commitment may require a new position at some level. Just a
Do
thought. Just a
we
thought.
do the calculation we can have that conversation, Nikki.
Yeah, I know. That's why I say it's just, I just.
Do the calculation that I think it's every other year right now, Dave. So.
Yeah, that's correct.
All right.
Yeah, biannual.
Yeah.
But I think, there'll be an increased emphasis here with regard to this tracking process and getting something in place with the businesses that are actively doing this, like finding Boyds that are out there that have already made this commitment and making sure that there's a proper accounting of that. That's going to be, if that's a desired strategy and focus, I mean, then, which I think it probably is lending itself to be here, is that we'll have to figure out from a resource allocation standpoint, how to make that happen. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we can.
Good afternoon. I joined. I apologize for being tardy, but I know Mary Ellen was unbelievable. I bet. Like, I've seen it. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
But wanted to join and make sure if there were questions, I did want to get input from the group, so I don't know the appropriate time. I also wanted to make sure Dave and Keith were going to meet me at yoga tomorrow night in the Tulips in the Park.
With bells on, I think is what they say to that, right? Is that what?
I think
I'm not sure
Dave
what
is
you
the
say to that.
instructor, if I heard correctly.
We're all going to see that.
It'll be exciting.
Jim, did you have something specific you wanted to lift up to the group? Now would be the best time.
Yeah, can I just flash these slides? It would take me 2.5, 3 minutes.
I don't control the technology, but if I did, it would be yours.
Okay, well, here.
You're good.
Okay. I tell you what, I'm going to close that. We're going to open a document. And I think the background that you're all talking about is right on. I just want to, Brian, you had mentioned that, hey, we want to do this, and I'm all for it. I just want to make sure that that we are getting going, that we are having an opportunity to do it. And I would like to get your opinion of it. Is it sharing now? Do you see it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, I think last time I showed you some of this, but I just want to run through to make sure that it meets your approval. Then I'd like to finish it, get the questions together, and then I'd like to begin with a group. And I don't know how to go about this because I want, Don and I have talked a lot about it. We want to make sure that we're giving this input. And I think you nailed it. Momentum is a big part of it. So again, the team who's on it, this is a listening tour. This is a very positive momentum building group. So all we want to do is ask, tell us about your plans. We want to know as a city and as a group that will allow us to engage and be part of what you're doing. So I have a series of questions. Again, I talked about them before, that we put other things on your mind. So you just want to start out. You don't want to tell them. You don't want to jump on them. In my experience, we're doing a series of listening tours with our dealers all over the world right now. It's very effective because they feel part of the plan. So those questions are things that Brian was just mentioned. Tell us about your goals. Tell us about your activity. Then when we're done with that, we do want to begin setting the groundwork that we do want to move ahead. And when you say we, I want that. I don't want to, Dave and Keith were real straight with me that we don't want to set something up that would worry them, but we want to look through these things. And again, as I said before, the basis, and this comes from Mary Ellen and some coaching that you've all given me, that we don't want to go at them saying, this is us saying there are business reasons to do this. It's not control reasons. So increase your revenue. And then each one of these has a discussion. And I love leading these. I love being with people and learning from them. So you're talking about how it differentiates, and what Mary Ellen said, that a lot of the folks now, our clients, are asking us for this type of thing to understand it. And I think that's true, not just in manufacturing. I think it's true in retail. I think it's in all the businesses that we want to be able to focus on. So these are some of the background. These are called proof statements. So you go through, and these are studies that were done on social responsibility, telling you, especially as the generational shifts take place, people are demanding this. They're saying these are the things we want to be, and they become more loyal. So again, just to touch on these. So go through them. how do we help mitigate risks? If you look at mitigate risk, this is going to help you going forward, that this is happening as you begin getting ready for what will happen later. And so each one of these, how do we reduce costs? What are some of the thought starters that we have? Again, the graphics team here will clean these up. These are just the thought starters that I wanted to make sure. And how do you engage the people that are stakeholders in your company? There's a lot of people, as you look at mergers and acquisitions, that are looking for the valuation to be leaning into this so that they're prepared for the future. So again, I wanted to do that. This is also that survey that we talked about earlier in my last meeting. So I put that in there so that they know that this isn't just a conversation that revolves around them, that the constituents that they serve in the community are also very concerned about what's happening and what it does. So today I promised 2 or 3 minutes, and I wanted to make sure we knew that's there. Brian had said, hey, can we get on with this and do some of this activity? I'd like approval to put together a list of who that is, so that we can come to you and say, these are the people we want to talk. And I do see a wide group of them. And I've talked to some of them in various social aspects I've been in the last couple of months. And everybody wants to talk about it, from business leaders that I've talked to. And that includes some of our competitors. Mary Ellen mentioned to me too, that she knows a lot of them from the communities that she serves, the community of practices that talk about this. So one, I wanted you to see the forethought, gain approval that this is something that makes sense. The next step would be putting together that list and bringing it back. But I think the momentum, again, what Brian and some of you said on the call, begins when we start engaging these people. You'll see it start to take effect in saying, these are things that we want to do. So the request is, does it make sense to move ahead to begin to get that list together? And then we'd like to go make it happen.
Yeah, so Jim, thanks. I think that we definitely, broad strokes, want to do a listening tour of the major employers. And I think as it relates to the specifics of the questions and the format and the timing and who exactly, I think we have that set aside for either a future session or two, or possibly in between sessions to sort of hammer some of that out, not only with yours, but also like the Frost Center and the public survey and that kind of a thing. So I think broadly, the answer is that looks like exactly the direction we want to head. And I don't know that there's anything more specific I would say at this point. Dave or Keith, do you want to maybe put a bow on that for me? Or otherwise, I know that we have to get to Joe in his presentation today.
The only thing I would say is, I think, like, as the group talked, I think a little bit before Jim came on too, is the difference between this work being done before SDT makes your recommendation as kind of a short, like getting information back, versus exercising a tactic that goes on and builds those long-term relationships, like Ann just talked about with PJ, with Transmatic, and making a similar type relationship with Boyd at Peach Wave. So to me, it's kind of a strategy versus a tactic. I think everyone knows there's power here. It's just when and who and how, which I think we can figure out and put a pin in it and have more conversations, Brian, and then bring it. That's kind of my thought.
Keith, when you're talking, it did strike me too that exercise, if it's going to be a part of the SDT's efforts, should we make sure that it helps inform the quality maybe of the opportunity matrix, some of the key things in the opportunity matrix. And are we on the right path for, strategic thinking? And the only thing I didn't see, Jim, was barriers. So I'd be curious to that type of a listening session, and maybe you intentionally left that out, of an open-ended question about what perceived barriers do you have to be successful, to implement certain strategies you may or may not be working on. Maybe there's barriers perceived on why they haven't even started. But to me, that helps link right back to opportunity matrix, big barriers that might be sitting there to help inform a strategy. But other than that, it starts to, I worry about it feeling a little too tactical.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I just, I'm going through this now. That's why I was late. We were rethinking some of the strategy work we're doing at Steelcase. And sometimes the action of engaging the people that you are serving informs the strategy, because you may be thinking one thing as you try to do that. So the engagement is a light one. It isn't something that's meant to, be set in stone. So I think it is part of a strategy. Listening and understanding what your constituents and what the people we serve are saying informs that strategy, I think, in a massive way. And I think business can be a huge mover for us that we need, very vital in Holland. So again, I wait for information. I think I'm ready to go when you are. Easy done.
What about the piece about, barriers though?
No, I said I said 100%. I think that's exactly the type of, those questions are left open for input from all of you. I think that's exactly the type of question. You want to know what's going well as some of the things that could enhance their efforts, right? Right on.
Yeah.
Very well.
Yeah, good. Well, thanks for the update, Jim, and we'll certainly be in touch, as we definitely intend on having a process around getting feedback from the businesses in town and all of this, for sure. So
Good.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna hand it right over to Joe. Mary Ellen, if feel free to hang out if you want. We're gonna learn all about how Holland compares with other cities Joe's been doing research on. But if you don't want to hang, we understand. So thanks again for being here. All right, Joe.
Thank you.
All righty, let me get set up to share my screen here. While I'm getting started, I'll just apologize in advance. My Wi-Fi has blinked out a couple times today, so if I disappear for a second, I'll try to come back. Still waiting for Dave to run fiber optic to my house.
Right after he's done doing the yoga session.
Sure. We've got a full list for him. So today, thanks for some time to just walk through kind of the recap and this final report from the benchmarking work I've been doing for you guys for the past few months. I'm going to start with just a recap of the process and how we kind of got to this final report. I'll discuss the focus cities that we selected and how we got to those and chose them through that matrix process. We'll take a look at some of the high-level themes and the collective takeaways from those 4 cities together before going into a deep dive of each community and seeing some of the unique aspects that came out of them. Before wrapping up, I'll touch on some of the other programs that we found in the non-focus cities, so communities that weren't necessarily comparable to Holland, but that still had an interesting program or something going on that we wanted to just make note of. And then I'll wrap up with just the conclusions and recommendations coming out of all of this work we've been doing here. So to start, I'll just rewind a second to where we started. Hopefully this matrix looks familiar. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago around the spring break timeframe, I think. But as you can see here, we have a couple dozen cities that showed up on the left, and this isn't the full screen, but the team should have had access to this at some point to go ahead and review it. But a couple dozen cities on the left that we chose for different reasons that we've used for economic indicators in the past that we knew were leading in the sustainability space. A couple that had a similar municipal utility structure like the Holland Board of Public Works, so we could get some comparisons there. And then we took those and we analyzed them against the triple bottom line and specifically key indicators and metrics that we thought were important to look at for compatibility and comparison for the city of Holland. So this 3-color system that you see here was just a quick way to give an indication of how close the city was. Green obviously means they were pretty close to Holland in that metric. Yellow meant that they were somewhat close, and then red meant that they were pretty far off and not very comparable. And again, in this matrix, there was data hidden behind those, so hundreds of different data points from things like census data and budgets and city reports and then sustainability reports and whatnot. But out of that work, we then were looking to see which of these cities had a lot of green or yellow dots and looked comparable to Holland, and then were also performing well in that sustainability category. So we could look to them for hopefully some plans or ideas or things that we could try to learn from as we go forward with this process. Out of that, several cities rose to the top for comparison in the people and profit section, but not all of them necessarily were leading in sustainability and things like community energy plans. So the 4 cities that we chose were ones that were comparable and also were excelling in that space. Moving into the deep dive process then, we selected these 4 cities that you can see on screen. So Grand Rapids and Lansing in Michigan for close neighbors. And then going out of state, we found Eau Claire, Wisconsin and Dubuque, Iowa to also be pretty comparable and to have some interesting programs that we wanted to check out and learn more about. So you can see here from these 4 communities, this is kind of just a quick snapshot of some of the work that's been happening there recently. Interestingly enough, each of the 4 has a plan in the last year or 2 that was updated. Some of them, it was a first plan and really getting started in this space around sustainability, climate action, and community energy. Others have a longer history and have been working for over a decade. But each of them has kind of revised this and made new statements and new action plans in the past year or 2. So good new content to look at and check out. But also coverage, right, of seeing different maturity and experience levels of people that are just starting or that have been looking at this for a long time. So into this deep dive process and how I went through it, to develop kind of a good profile of each community, we tried to answer questions and find information around the topics that you see on screen here. We did this using sustainability and climate action plans, which I'll talk about a little bit more through this presentation. Strategic plans, so kind of the larger city structure documents, integrated resource plans, city budgets, other published documentation, in conjunction with in-person one-on-one interviews, not in person, but over Zoom interviews with sustainability managers from each community. And so that was able to provide us with a unique perspective and kind of get a good taste of what it's looked like downstream of this decision and planning process in those communities, and to see the people that are working day to day to try to implement and follow through on those commitments, understand how it's going, what are their pain points, where are they finding successes, and to get kind of that good human take beyond just the words and the documents on what's going on there. So shout out to the Ann Salyers, and I think Barry was on here too, and the Dan Brorsmiths of the world that are doing that work. It was these counterparts in those communities that we spoke to for that. But there's questions, yeah, so looking at things like, what did the decision-making process look like? How did they come to this decision? Why were they looking to do this? What was community support and involvement like? How did they go through that process? And how has reception been to the targets that they set? Where does funding come from? We know that's important to actually implement and make these things happen. There's got to be some dollars driving those. Is there any unique programs that they're leveraging to be able to fund the work that they're doing? And then who's responsible for implementation? So what does the staffing and the structure look like to make sure you're meeting these goals and to check in and revise those as they go through the timelines that they've set? And then we kind of wrapped up with just an opportunity for people to share the successes and the struggles that they're having, and make recommendations to a community that's checking in again, right, and looking at in the city of Holland what we're doing with the community energy plan. So moving into the good stuff, right here with kind of the common takeaways and some of the high-level themes that we found throughout this process. There's a couple big ones here to start. So the first one is that each of these communities had a strong mayor or city council that was supporters of sustainability and wanted to see ambitious action in this space. Most of them campaigned on promises around this, came into the office with intentions of setting a goal around this. You know, that was part of what their constituents were looking for, and something that they intended to do kind of regardless of what was going on or what the situation was. They're inspired by things like the Kyoto Protocol, so looking back a little bit up to the Paris Climate Agreement, and in the past 4 or 5 years, looking at things like the US government kind of rolling back some of the regulations and targets set around sustainability, and feeling an impetus on the city to try to step up and meet some of those needs in the climate and sustainability space. So that's what was driving those people in those positions. For our next point, this is kind of a big important one, was that these cities and many of the non-focused cities in the matrix made their goals and these commitments around renewable energy and carbon neutrality before they had put plans in place or had done feasibility assessments or really looked into how they were going to achieve those targets that they set. The groundwork to actually meet those targets was laid in the months or years following, or in some cases has yet to actually put together. So setting that mark before really looking to how it's actually going to happen. So we see proactive targets and things that look bold and ambitious, but more reactive planning and staffing, and committees that are doing a little bit of work to play catch up and come through on the promises that were made. Moving on for our next one, cities are working with sustainability and climate action plans, not community energy plans. So the nuance there is that the sustainability and climate action approach kind of gives them a broader lens and a more holistic way to look at this conversation. Community energy is very all-encompassing, and it's a big part of these plans these communities have set, but it doesn't cover every topic, and it doesn't quite weave together some of the other conversations that are happening in this space. So there was a tactical difference in the plans and kind of the nomenclature on what they're doing with them. Another big one, and this is something that we learned from those interviews in person, is that we're finding that staff in these cities kind of reported an imbalance between the goal setting and the publicity around these and the actual follow through on the action taking place. So plans are relatively new, and COVID has definitely slowed things down for some people. But the managers that we spoke to said they're struggling to operationalize and to get started on these plans they've made. A lot of dollars and resources went into pulling people together to set these targets, but now actually moving the needle is something that they're having some difficulty with. And then these last two minor common themes that we're looking at, staffing and structure looks pretty similar across the board, usually around 1 to 3 dedicated full-time employees, or at least part-time. Part of their role is this, and then supported by committees and different community resources that we're trying to leverage and to help embed these in the rest of the community's goals. And then the last one comes as a no-brainer and is pretty timely for today, that each of these communities put a heavy emphasis on buildings and that commercial and industrial focus, knowing that this is a huge part of the community's carbon footprint, that it's something that's accessible and attainable, and there's solutions existing that they can implement, and that the city has some different points that they can pull on and levers that they can use to move people in this space. So with that, we'll switch gears and start walking through each of these 4 cities and kind of give a little profile of each of them. For time's sake, I won't read through all of this, but this is just kind of a quick snapshot of what was comparable to the city of Holland. With Grand Rapids, we can see here it's a slightly larger population. The most recent greenhouse gas emissions inventory was around 12.1 metric tons per capita. But this big headline goal that we're looking at out of the city of Grand Rapids, and kind of the thing that they're holding up as their mark, is 100% renewable energy for the city and city operations specifically by 2025. Grand Rapids' headline goal is coming from 2 places. It's their 2017 through 2021 sustainability report, as well as their strategic plan. So it's knit right into the city's strategic plan. And those are the real drivers for action around this in the city. Grand Rapids was unique among our 4 communities for the way that they address the scope of goals. And so we'll see kind of going forward here that cities usually either choose to set municipal scale goals for just city operations or community-wide goals. And in most cases throughout that matrix, what I found was that it was one or the other. But Grand Rapids stood out in that they're trying to look at both, at least in some way. So we see here that big level goal, right, is 100% renewable energy by 2025. But at the same time, they're working with the community and trying to address community goals through more of a collective and a partnership approach. They mentioned that the city's emissions only account for around 2% of total community emissions. So understanding that and respecting that, rather than creating some decree just from the city for the rest of the community, they're doing a huge engagement process through things like the 2030 district or the Zero Cities project, which are 2 things that are really focused on the business communities and looking at how to lower building carbon emissions. And then on the more community and residential and organizational side, they have the Community Collaboration on Climate Change, which is called C4 for an acronym. Really great work engaging other people to kind of step into this space and help take responsibility and get involved in creating goals and taking accountability for the work, as well as I believe it's the Community Sustainability Partnership. And I have links for all of these in a written report that kind of parallels this presentation if you want to check them out on your own time. But we see with Grand Rapids, right, that city level leadership for what they can control, and then working with the community, not just setting a goal for the community, but actually doing an engagement process and facilitating that process of trying to set goals with the community, and kind of a double-edged approach there. In terms of staffing, the city of Grand Rapids has 3 full-time staff members that are working on this for their jobs, and then they help to embed their goals and targets into the other departments in the city. They also leverage some other committees and resources, but we have a team of 3 that's really driving the work there. And beyond funding for staffing, a lot of the funding is coming from grant funding, doing a lot of different outreach with foundations and utilities, because they have an investor-owned utility rather than a municipally owned utility, but kind of doing a project by project basis, really looking at grants there. Something unique around funding would be the PACE district is set up in Grand Rapids. It's been there since 2017, but according to their community energy manager, it's not something that's been leveraged by a lot of businesses in town. They find that it's more lucrative to get financing elsewhere. The rates are better, and it's just not something they've had much success or traction with thus far. So that was interesting to hear. Other big highlights, the progress, I mean, it's kind of really the bottom line that we're trying to look at here, and we're seeing in Grand Rapids, they are making some progress towards this municipal city goal of 100% renewable energy. As of this year in March, they did another benchmark and found that 37% of energy was coming from renewable resources, and they expect that to climb to 41% as they commission a new solar project on their water filtration plant. So slowly working their way up towards that goal, but obviously have some work to do to meet that 100% in the next 4 to 5 years. So jumping a little bit further down the road to Lansing. Lansing was unique and kind of stuck out for the similarity that they have a similar municipal utility setup. So somewhat of a mirror of the Holland Board of Public Works. There's a little bit different of a structure, but much closer than the other cities that have an investor-owned utility. So we can see that relationship kind of reflected there and some of the opportunities that they have. Again, a slightly larger population than the city of Holland, but a little bit closer. And then emissions per capita, the most recent greenhouse gas inventory was 12.4 metric tons. Goals, and it's plural here for the city of Lansing between the city and the Board of Water and Light, is carbon neutrality by 2040. And I'll try to dive in and kind of explain the difference that's going on here. So we'll start with the city, and the city has set in its climate action plan for 2020 through 2023. Again, like Grand Rapids, just the municipal level goal for city operations of carbon neutrality by 2040. They have an interim 2030 mark that they're trying to meet, but 2040 is kind of the all-in, we're going to be carbon neutral by then deadline that they're setting. This came out of a plan that was created by a separate consultant. And then after that consultant, again, is where they hired in someone to try to fulfill and meet these goals. So they've since hired a full-time sustainability manager. It's the first one in the city who's been brought in and tasked with meeting this target that they've set. She's working on refining some of the greenhouse gas inventories and working with new data, trying to create a better plan to build upon this first one that they've set to meet that. They've not found much traction thus far from the city and really haven't recorded a whole lot of progress towards this goal of carbon neutrality. An interesting note is before they set it in 2019, the mayor and city council brought 100% renewable energy credits for city operations, right? That city focus to the city budget and proposed that, and it was shot down 6-1. And there was a struggle over, is this the right way to do it? And how are we supposed to go through, is it renewable energy credits, or should we be focusing on efficiency in-house and things like that? So they're working through some initial pains of trying to figure out how to get started here, but not a whole lot of progress thus far. The Board of Water and Light, on the other hand, is kind of this parallel goal that they've set, and rather than a municipal level, they've set it for their service territory. So this is kind of the proxy community goal of 2040 being the deadline for community-wide carbon neutrality for their customers. This one, in a similar fashion, was set by the commission. They did some public outreach and engagement, and the commission was excited about it, but they didn't have a roadmap or a plan in place. So they had positive feedback, were excited, but they, since setting that, have not really shown much progress thus far. We spoke to staff there, and they said that their first 10 years, so from now until 2030, is really targeted on efficiency improvements and usage reductions, phasing out some of the higher carbon fuels as the contracts expire. But they're waiting a little bit and are using what they would call a least regret approach as they wait for hopefully more technologies to come out and to become more affordable and to really get aggressive in the next 5 to 10 years. But for now, they're kind of just setting that goal and waiting to get started. So off to a conservative start in Lansing. Definitely, it's a newer plan, right, coming out in 2020. So we can understand that they might be a little slow to start with COVID and figuring some things out here, but not a whole lot of progress to match the goal that they've set. Moving out of state to Dubuque, Iowa. These two out-of-state ones are interesting. They have a little bit longer of a history. Dubuque has been doing sustainability and focused on sustainability as a city since around 2006. As we can see here, it's a closer size and population, a lot of different similarities to the city of Holland. Emissions per capita as of their most recent greenhouse gas inventory were 14.1 metric tons per capita. And the big goal in Dubuque, and this has been set since 2013, was 50% emissions reduction by 2030, and that's from a 2003 baseline. You can see here, this is just a timeline from one of the reports showing kind of a long history and some well laid out trajectory through the years, with 2006 being that place where they really started to pick up speed, and then 2013 being where they adopted this 50% by 2030 goal. And Dubuque is interesting out of these cities that we know. I mean, the city of Holland, right, has talked about being a leader in this space, and everyone wants to be a leader and have performance. Dubuque has said that, but has also been intentional about creating a replicable model and sharing some of their tactics and their progress with other communities. So they have their sustainable action plan that they've released in the past year or two, but they've also released documents specifically for other communities to learn from them and the progress that they've set. And they also hold an annual sustainability conference just for other cities to come and collaborate and brainstorm with them. So really intentional about the way that they're going through this process and journeying with other communities towards their goal. Dubuque has an interesting approach to funding, so nothing crazy like revolving funds or anything like that. But the way that they engage with their community is they've set up community micro grants. So they award $2,500 grants, up to 10 of those a year, to different projects proposed by citizens, by organizations and businesses in the community, to try to get people involved and to encourage things around energy efficiency. They've supported the startup of a community garden, things of that nature. So if you can propose a project that aligns with their 12 sustainability principles, they're trying to empower the community to step up and also engage in this work and in the progress that's taking place. Carbon shadows pricing was mentioned at the beginning of this conversation today, and that's something that's also being piloted here. So Dubuque set up a price on carbon for specifically their fleet management and looking at how they're trying to procure new vehicles. And they're setting that up to make some of those lower carbon and newer technologies more affordable and more attractive. So it's been interesting to watch, and they're trying to pilot that for more programs in the city as they go forward here. We are again seeing some incremental progress. So Dubuque has moved forward and kind of pushed the needle here. Let me find my stat a second. So since in 2019, since that 2003 baseline, they've achieved a 27% reduction in their emissions, again, moving towards 50%. But that is up from 60% in 2014. So they're starting off slow and kind of picking up speed here, but we're seeing a need to keep that pace and continue to move aggressively in the coming years if they want to hit that 2030 mark. They did caution that a lot of their time and effort recently has gone into this planning and focus on publicity and sharing with other communities. I mean, creating all those metrics and different plans has kind of created a little bit of an issue where they're consuming some of their time and resources for implementation and action with things that aren't actually moving the needle and pushing them forward. So a caution around too many goals and too many metrics and reports, that those can consume staff time and burden people that are trying to work to actually push the needle towards these renewable energy goals and lowering carbon in the communities. Eau Claire, for our last community here to dive into, Eau Claire has a population of around 68,000, so a little bit closer to the city of Holland there. Emissions per capita are close to Dubuque at 13.1 metric tons. And the goal that we see coming out of Eau Claire is carbon neutrality and 100% renewable energy by 2050. This is the furthest out goal, but Eau Claire has set up incremental steps where they're trying to ramp up each year from a 1% reduction to a 2.5% reduction, kind of stepping up through time. So it's a long ways out, but they're trying to set up a track to meet that over the next couple of decades. Eau Claire got into this plan and kind of moved into this space after the Paris Climate Accord. Their city council commissioned a study to try to figure out how they could be in step with the findings of that process. So they commissioned a report called Towards a Renewable City. That report's aim was to try to find a couple of different items that they could shoot for to try to meet the Paris Climate Accord and stay in step with that. The big goal that we found of that right is that 100% renewable by 2050. They committed to that before having an implementation plan in place. And then in the years following, produced what they call the Renewable Energy Action Plan, which is the roadmap now to meet that. So committed in the 2018, 2019 timeframe, and now around 2020 are getting started towards moving into that space and achieving those incremental reductions of 1% up to 2.5% and scaling up to that 2050 goal. An interesting piece here would be that Eau Claire got their energy plan from the investor-owned utility in their service territory. So Xcel Energy provided them with kind of a base framework that they started with, and then they took this framework, developed a steering committee, and refined it for their needs. So rather than starting from scratch, they had a tested framework that had been used in other spaces, and then pulled that in and developed it to work for their goals. Staffing that has since been tasked with achieving the goals set out by this plan, rather than having one specific person or a team that's sustainability targeted, they have a multidisciplinary team from across departments, and it's just a fraction of the work that they do. So they call this their City Green Team. It's led up by the city planner, and then they have members from transportation departments and parks and rec departments across the board that have to come together and try to bring this back to their spaces and integrate it into their day-to-day work. Funding here, as with our other cities, is heavily grant-driven. They're trying to do their best to look at low-cost campaigns that still have high impact, working with community partners like local nature centers, with Xcel Energy to try to do outreach and education, but trying to figure out more sustainable ways to create funding for the long term. So rather than relying on grants, they've set up a renewable energy fund to do some of those energy efficiency projects. But again, just being started, they said that they've had a little bit of difficulty figuring out how to leverage that best in these first few years here. There's not readily available data for Dubuque for the last couple of years. 2018 was the most recent report, and from the 2018 to 2015 timeframe, that's where their most recent greenhouse gas inventories were released. They had only marginal improvements, and they recorded just a lot of fluctuations, and said that they were trying to figure out if it was a trend that had just been thrown off by high usage in a year, or if they were actually just struggling to meet this task that they've set. But as you can see on the bottom of the screen here, as I've mentioned, this 1% up to 4% scale that they're going through each decade, they've got some leeway here at the start, but we'll need to pick that up in the next couple of years if they want to stay on track with that. And you can see with that approach, it can be helpful if you think that technology will become more available and you'll be able to chew off bigger chunks as time goes on. But it also can come back to bite you if you get to that point and have just bigger and bigger pieces that you need to take down and you haven't built the momentum to get there. So again, ambitious goals. They have a lot of community interest, but not yet moving the needle in that space. How are we doing on time here? I'll try to breeze through these quick. These are just a couple different communities that we pulled out from that benchmark just for things that they have going on and interesting programs. So Columbia, Missouri stood out. Similar to the Holland Board of Public Works, they have a municipal utility there that's doing a great job of leading with things that they can control and things that are in the scope of the city and their Board of Public Works day-to-day activities, but then also in each of their activities and the reports and all of the things that they release, they're trying to share what the community is doing and how they're working in partnership with businesses and organizations and residents to share the work and to share in the successes that are happening there. Park Forest, Illinois stood out for their usage of RECs. They cover 100% of residential and small commercial electricity usage. They're doing this at no additional cost through an aggregated purchasing contract with a local energy supplier. They are very different in their demographics, so they have kind of a unique opportunity that allows them to do this, but certainly a leader in already offsetting 100% of residential and small commercial through RECs. Madison, Wisconsin has a unique solar program. They call it Madison, kind of a fun pun, but doing things like group purchasing, big grants and different incentives for rooftop and kind of the microgrid development in that community. Urbana, Illinois, rather than microgrid, is looking at things like community solar and community geothermal. They don't have a similar Board of Public Works setup, so they're dealing with an investor-owned utility, which makes the group purchase and the community solar a little bit more attractive. But offering unique ways to lower rates for their customers while at the same time encouraging the use of these low carbon, clean energy options. Ann Arbor, we have to include, right, because in the state of Michigan, we know that's a big goal and kind of the ambitious leaders that have set municipal targets and citywide targets there. As we found in that benchmarking matrix that I showed at the beginning of this presentation, very different demographics and characteristics of that city, so not quite comparable in that space. But certainly someone to watch in the coming years and to see how they do as they start to operationalize towards those targets. And then lastly, Northampton, Massachusetts stood out. They've released a plan recently that has a large segment focused on how they use their parks and open spaces within city limits to sequester carbon. So looking at ways and best practices for soil carbon sequestration and how to create more effective forests and grasslands and things like that within the city to sequester some of their carbon emissions. So with that, I'll jump into conclusions and recommendations. And our big conclusions that we're finding here is that these cities that are setting these really ambitious targets and goals around renewable energy and carbon neutrality in good faith and before they create these plans are having good luck in starting conversations and creating kind of a catalyst for action, but are not showing yet that proportional follow through on their implementation and operationalization towards those goals. So they've set the mark, but the needle is just not moving yet, whether it's COVID or lack of community engagement. They're just not really going to meet the bar, it looks like, at this stage in the game. A caveat to that conversation would be that the cities that are setting those municipal level goals and focused on city targets that they can control are moving and seem a little bit more likely to have success than cities that are setting community-wide goals because they have the ability to implement and have actions that will actually move the bar, right? So if you set a community-wide goal and you're like Grand Rapids that only has 2% of your emissions contributing to that, they're counting on 98% of those emissions to be affected by someone outside of their direct control. So people that are setting those city-focused targets are having more success and then creating pathways and roadways for the rest of the community to get on board and facilitating that collective and partnership-based approach. Another recommendation out of each of these cities, specifically from our sustainability managers, was to be selective in goal setting. So these people downstream are struggling with plans and implementation strategies that have too many metrics attached to them that aren't impactful. So advice here would be to be selective with goals that will naturally make other dominoes fall and inherently move the bar, and pick the few key indicators that we have to shoot for that allow our staff and our resources to go towards action and implementation rather than constantly trying to check in on dozens or hundreds of different metrics that we're trying to track through this process. Another big one would be to leverage existing frameworks. So as we saw with Eau Claire and using that Excel Energy framework, other communities have used things from ICLEI and USDM, and those are some of the national organizations that help put these together. But borrowing and stealing from communities those plans that we know have been set in place so that more time and resources can be put into the action and implementation moving forward than spinning our wheels on trying to get started when we know the real work begins once the plan has been committed to. And then the last one here would just be to recognize that energy is part of a larger picture, right? So these community sustainability and climate action plans, as opposed to a community energy plan, are a little bit more equipped to handle this broader conversation. Community energy is a huge part of it, but we have to know that there's kind of fringe pieces here going on that need to be addressed too, and that this is not entirely encompassing those. So this is a good place to start, but also understanding that we need to engage in things outside of the scope of just energy. So with that, as I think I mentioned here, there is a written report that goes along with this that should hopefully be included in the packet. I don't know, Keith or Dave can chime in, but it will have some of the resources from these cities that you can check out if you want to learn more about the plans that they've committed to, as well as some different highlights and stories out of those to learn more. But I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to do some of this work alongside of you and to get involved in this project. And I'll turn it over to Brian or Keith if you want to lead in questions or comments from here.
Yeah, Brian, I'm going to let you lead the questions and discussions, but if I could just jump in, Joe referenced kind of how we'll get this information out. Joe's done a phenomenal job. I want to spend even more time on this, but I have seen he's got a written report that has all the links in it that he responded to, but also just because, and we kind of made a joke of it, but Joe, it's like he's always on the agenda and then we give him like 45 seconds. So I think Joe was worried the same thing was going to happen to him today. So Joe actually has shot a series of videos in bite-sized piece that go through everything that he just presented. And we're going to make sure, and I think he did a brilliant job with that. I looked at that this weekend. We're also going to make that available to you here very quickly. So you can rewatch this if you want, but you can also, look, my light went off because our energy efficiency program here at the city. But we'll also make those videos available to you too, so you can, because there's so much stuff that he just went through. So I'm just downloading that, and then Brian, I'll give it to you to facilitate discussion and Q&A.
Yeah, that's great. Joe, I'll kick off with maybe a overly simple, but maybe moral of the story question. So is it fair to say, based on your research, that in spite of these other communities having more aggressive goals, one could argue they don't have the kind of working plan, like written or active, that Holland does right now?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair way to summarize it. The communities that stood out in that matrix were communities that had created headline targets, but not necessarily we found communities that have put those roadmaps in place. Some have since developed them, but aren't acting on them yet, whereas Holland looks more like the reverse, where there might not be a new aggressive goal since the original CEP goal, but the roadmap and the pathways to get to those targets seem to be more developed.
I like being in that spot versus the other spot, by the way. So hat tip to everybody from 10 years ago. Other questions?
Joe, on leadership, I like that you touched on that for each of them. I wanted to make sure, because we were going quick, from your perspective, organizationally, do any of the benchmark communities have a true sort of figurehead leader that has been given the appropriate power to execute?
That's a great question. I would say it's hard to say, until someone has met the goal, then we know they've had the success, right? It looks to me like Grand Rapids, being a larger city, is more resourced with a staff of 3, and with Allison leading them there, they have a strong system set up to get there. They're also leveraging community resources, right, to help play into some of the work that they're doing. So I would say Grand Rapids looks the most set up for success structurally. Others really don't, right? There's places that have a single sustainability manager for these goals that are coming up in 5 to 10 years, and we know that they're off track. Just sounded overloaded and sounded like they had a lot that they were trying to handle and juggle in their day-to-day work. So I would say Grand Rapids stood out as kind of the best of the 4.
What's interesting about that, Joe, I happen to be friends with Allison, is she gets pulled into tons of other stuff outside of sustainability, and the stuff that they are like, they've got real explicit lines, and you reference this around like the city's goal relative to what the city controls, and then they're really just a facilitator of other stuff. And they've got real clear lines around that, where I don't know that we do quite so much, but that's good feedback.
Yeah, it's great that we have a local benchmark structurally, at least, resource, at least early phase.
Yeah. Other questions for Joe? I know that we're over time, but that was good. And we can make time next time to circle back on this, because we'll have all the report to digest and all the videos to watch. But anything else immediately? Okay. Joe, it was more than 45 seconds.
I appreciate it.
But not a lot more.
That's all right. I rushed a little bit, so I really would encourage you. I think the recording that I did that Keith referred to in this report has a little bit more on each community. So I would encourage you, if you have time, to check those out. And the videos are broken up into 5-minute sections of kind of each slide that I went through. So if there's a specific one you want to look at, you can learn more about just that one. And then the links are available in the description of each of those videos to kind of do some self-guided research on what's happening in those spaces. But thanks again.
Yeah, I appreciate, and I think it's nice that it's was emphasized. It's more than just energy. It's a whole sustainability, and it's a wider area, and supported by the city, by the council, and everyone else. So that's important. Thank you. This was amazing. We will need more time to really look at it.
Yeah. Jeff.
Just an organizational thing. All of the stuff that Joe, are we going to have like a Joe section in the resource document?
I hope so.
How is that going to actually be disseminated?
So that report that Keith touched on will go into the resources document, and it will basically, the videos that he cut, he did an amazing job sort of following closely what he did in terms of the actual YouTube videos. So they're all links within that actual summary report.
Okay, so that's in, so there's a resource document and then links inside of that.
Yes. At the very top, there's the YouTube links, and then there'll be various clickable links within that report too.
So that'll be, when will that actually be like updated in the resource document and available?
Probably just because I think the importance here, Jeff, and just so it doesn't get lost in the resources document, I'm going to work with Cinca and Dave tomorrow. I think I've got everything that Joe sent over. But what I'm going to suggest is, one, for kind of long-term posterity, we're going to put it in the resources document. But I think in the meantime, and to get this out to you, by 5 o'clock tomorrow is going to be my goal that I set for myself and Cinca. We're going to send you a targeted and specific communication that just has Joe's stuff that he's referenced.
Good idea.
So you don't have
That's
to.
what I was going to ask for. I was going to say, can we just get that sooner rather than later?
Yeah. So just
make it easy
both
on you.
of those things are going to happen. By 5 o'clock tomorrow, you'll get just a communication just on the Joe stuff. But then we'll, for the rest of time, we'll link it into the resources document.
Okay, awesome. I just wanted to say, Joe, thank you for all the background work. This is awesome.
I appreciate the opportunity.
The other thing I was going to mention real quick too, I asked Joe to, and I think, we're interested as we move forward on the levers and on strategy development, to be checking in against these other communities that may have implemented or tried to implement similar types of strategies, to where there's either alignment with success or maybe, trouble ahead, so, those are some things too that hopefully Joe's able to glean from some of his research, to be a good sounding board for advice as we develop those strategies.
And we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time.
Right. Good. Anything else from anyone for Joe?
Joe, in Dubuque, the only other thing, did you say that they're providing, so they're paying others to do little micro grants to do small carbon offsetting projects? It's not the other way around that we were talking earlier where,
they set $25,000 a year aside under their budget, and it's split into up to 10 $2,500 micro grants. And it's not just around efficiency and energy, it's anything that meets their 12 sustainability principles. So there's a link to that will come by 5 o'clock tomorrow that describes what the different parameters are to meet that. But the goal was for them to empower and allow different community members to take action into their own hands.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Cool. Okay.
I guess, sorry, one more thought. This is a little bit off topic, but I guess on topic of what if you could have a program like that where Boyd's $400 instead of going to this company could go locally to, to help offset somebody's electrical cost because it helped them put solar on their roof or something like that. How can we get some of that money to stay here and do, I don't know, just kind of thinking off the top of my head.
No, Jeff, that's exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about when we are talking about creating a local market, a buyer and, supply and demand sort of idea. I don't think that would be a real new leadership sort of program to be able to create both ends of the transaction. And I think Joe and I have had some conversations and bumped into other conversations. And I think that will be a real thing that we'll chew on to some degree, or in the report, say, study this, something. Because I think the appetite's there. I think PJ hit on something really important earlier around, if local business owners in particular can see their investment benefiting the local community, with this as sort of a layer, an excuse to invest, carbon reduction, I think that the kind of adoption is going to be a heck of a lot higher.
Maybe
I mean, I guess
budgets.
You can get people to sponsor a little league baseball team because it gets their name on a cap, and right. I mean, you can get, if you can combine some of these things into some of the more local efforts where, you can see the local dollars at work. I think it could be something unique, but maybe attractive to some businesses.
Well, and I know that energy sits inside of sustainability or ESG or corporate responsibility at most organizations, and especially the larger ones, and Mary Ellen maybe could speak to this, but I know that the S in ESG is social, and that's like volunteering. And so there's your real combo platter is your employees go and plant trees, right? And so you've got a social thing, a volunteer thing, and a carbon thing. All that, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I think could be pretty powerful and interesting, and would be ours to chew on. So,
and I can't help but speak up there, Brian and Jeff, and say that's built into the strategy of why council invested in some of the things that we've invested in the last 2 years of a sustainability project coordinator full-time underneath a part-time assistant city manager sustainability. And quite frankly, that we have a partnership with the ODC to do sustainability work. And so it's always nice, right, when you get a report back from a third party that kind of says there's some things that we're doing that are kind of best practice already. But we can do more, and that's where these discussions are great, right? Where do we continue to put our time and energy and investment in, and really get those on-ramps, those pathways to get the business community and the residential community even more involved and supportive. So great conversation, great work by Joe.
Yeah. We got a meeting on May 17. I think it's on the table to discuss in person or not.
Yes.
If you're like me, you'll be fully vaccinated 2 weeks post second shot by then, and would be happy to meet in person. But I don't know how we want to go about it as a group.
Let's vote and then select a place.
Well, it depends on if PJ is still basking in the 100-degree sun, right?
He'll be back.
I'll be in Holland.
Okay.
May 17.
God says thumbs up on in person. And I think a subtext in there was the brew merchant. I wasn't totally sure, but maybe.
Okay, we'll target in person, and maybe it'd be good just because sometimes people, if you want to kind of register a concern or anything, maybe just let Brian or Dave or I know, or Travis as vice chair, but we'll tentatively kind of drive Mr. Chair for May 17, and then we'll be back in council chambers.
Okay.
Awesome.
Let's do it. I definitely think part of the agenda will focus on consuming and digesting Joe's report, and circling back on that, I think, is a big part of next time. And then I'll touch base with Travis, Keith, and Dave on other parts of the agenda. We've got community feedback. We're through all the levers. So we're getting into I don't dare say home stretch, but closer to the home stretch for sure on this thing. So, yeah, unless there's anything else, I'll adjourn the meeting, everybody.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Ellen.
You're welcome.